What's the most unlikely situation you've developed a friendship in? I was a fresh high school graduate and got my first job at a Hollywood video store in my hometown. I'd only been working there a few weeks at the time of the incident, and it was my first time working the closing shift on a Friday night. We locked the doors at 12, and then my supervisor, David, showed me how to shut everything down so we could go home. He was a nice enough dude, but I hadn't worked with him before, so I didn't know him personally at all. We left together at around 1 a.m. The second he locked the door, some guy stormed around the corner of the building and started walking towards us. I wasn't sure if he was even planning on interacting with us, but David immediately put himself between me and the guy. They started arguing, and David told him he needed to go or he'd call the cops again. He even called him by name, Daniel. It all happened so fast that I didn't have time to react. Daniel pulled out a switchblade, grabbed David by the collar of his shirt and stabbed him under the chin. I'll never forget the sound the knife made when it went through his skin. Or the sound it made when Daniel yanked it back out. He let go of David and just took off into the night. There was absolutely no way I could chase him down, especially knowing he had a weapon and clearly had no issues using it. I knew the only thing I could do was call for help. Kevin had this little Nokia phone that I used to call 911, and then I just stayed with him. He was bleeding a lot and he couldn't talk. So I just held his hand while he lay on the pavement and cried. I used my car keys to rip off a chunk of my shirt to press against the wound to try and stop some of the bleeding until the ambulance arrived. It felt like we waited for hours, but he was loaded into the ambulance and on his way to the hospital before 1:15. The cops took my statement, but there wasn't much I could say since I wasn't even sure what happened. Then they gave me a lift home. The next morning, my boss called me and told me he'd gotten my closing shift that night covered. And told me to take the weekend off. I went to see David in the hospital that same day. He still couldn't talk, but he did have a whiteboard so he could write stuff down. He told me that Daniel was his ex. David had recently ended their 4-year relationship and moved out of their shared apartment, which had made Daniel start acting scary. He would show up at David's folks' house demanding to see him. He slashed the tires of David's car twice and started leaving threatening messages in his mailbox. David told the cops each time these things happened, but this was rural-ish Ohio and they weren't taking him seriously because he was gay. 2 days before Daniel came to our work, David's father found a dead rat on their front doorstep. The police had simply written it off again, stating that a cat had probably left it there. The force of the blow had fractured his mandible and palate as well as knocked out a few teeth. He had to have his jaw wired shut for a while, but even though he couldn't speak, he wouldn't stop thanking me. He must have written it 100 times in the hour or two I sat with him that day. I could tell he was really scared still, so I promised him I'd come back the next day to visit again. I went straight to the cops to tell them everything I could about Daniel from what David had told me. They arrested him later that day and he still had the bloody knife in his front pocket when they caught him. He was eventually charged with assault with a deadly weapon and sentenced to 5 years in prison. I visited David in the hospital every day while he was there and continued going to see him even after he was released into the care of his parents. They continued to thank me endlessly for staying with their son after it happened. I went back to work that Wednesday and David eventually came back too, but only after his jaw was healed. 6 years later, he was the best man at my wedding. 4 years after that, he made me and my wife the godparents of his first child. Daniel was in and out of prison for the next 15 years for other minor offenses, before he passed away in a drunk driving accident. David is still in my life today and has been my closest friend for more than 2 decades at this point. A few times a year, he still thanks me for staying with him that night and not just letting him bleed out on the pavement. I always tell him the same thing: I'd do it again in a heartbeat. I was just a kid and I was really scared, but I knew he needed my help. I just did what I hoped someone else would do for me in the same situation.
Am I the only one who questions how judges become judges? I feel that the justice system needs more work. What do you guys think about this?